By the time the moon climbed over the pines, the road to Willow Bend was a river of light and shouting. Horses foamed at the bit, iron shoes throwing sparks on the packed dirt. Men in shirts dark with sweat rode with torches lifted high, the flames bending in the heavy night air. Dogs strained on leashes, voices breaking into frantic barks whenever the wind shifted from the direction of the swamps. Word had gone out before sundown. Eleanor Whitfield, 6 years old, hair the color of dry corn silk, had walked away from the big house porch and never come back. Someone had seen her at the edge of the cotton rows, chasing a moth. After that, the land had simply swallowed her between the fields and the low, breathing dark of the Edisto River bottoms. Inside the house, Mrs. Whitfield was somewhere beyond reason, half held down by 2 maids. Outside, her husband moved like a man whose own roof was on fire. He shouted for more men, more lanterns, more dogs. It was not just fear for the child, a planter's daughter, lost and maybe taken by swamp or snake or prowling man. That was talk that could travel far beyond Barnwell District. It could stain a name, invite questions, sermons about God's displeasure. Down near the slave quarters, the sound of the riders rolled over the cabins like distant thunder. Men and women stood in the doorways, bare feet in the dust, watching the bright confusion move toward the marsh. Somewhere in that low murmur of voices, a phrase began to repeat, passed from mouth to mouth. "Call the boy. Call little Isaiah." He stood back at first, half in shadow, a thin child in a too-short shirt, legs all shin and ankle, bare toes pressed into the warm earth. 8, maybe 9 years old. Son of Ruth from the field gangs. His hands hung straight at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if he already carried something heavy no one else could see. The overseers argued about him in front of everyone. Cobb, the younger one, laughed and spat. "You gonna trust a pickaninny over hounds, sir? Dogs'll find her." Another crossed himself in a quick, guilty motion. "I don't like it. Folks say he got a smell for trouble. That ain't right." A third, older, scratched his jaw. "All I know, that boy walked straight to Jonas in the canal last year. Had no tracks to follow. Found him laying there cold as stone." Whitfield listened, jaw working, eyes flicking from the torchlit woods to the dark line of the river. Pride and habit told him to dismiss it. The silence in the house, where his wife had run out of screams, told him something else. "Let the boy try," he said, the words flat, like they tasted wrong in his mouth. They brought Isaiah forward. He did not look at the white men. His gaze stayed low, somewhere between his own feet and the line where hard yard soil gave way to softer field earth. When the nearest dog snapped at him, he flinched, but only once. Then he drew a breath that seemed to stop halfway into his chest. He stepped off the packed ground and into the rows. Under his soles, the soil went from dry dust to a faint, clinging damp. His stride shortened. He was listening, not with his ears, but with something else. Every few steps his toes gripped, as if testing the pull beneath him. Once, he reached out and laid his palm flat against a pine trunk, eyes closing for a heartbeat. Men on horseback watched, restless, shifting, passing a flask, hand to hand, as if that would steady them. Inside him the weight grew, slow and steady, a pressure behind the eyes, a band tightening at the back of his skull, a stone settling behind his breastbone. He did not have words for it. The closest his child's mind could come was this. Some part of the ground ahead of him was not flat. It dragged at him, the way a deep well pulls at a bucket line when it slips. They reached the edge of the marsh, where the field rows broke off and the land turned soft and uncertain. Fireflies rose from the reeds, blinking in and out like weak signals. The dogs whined, picking up too many scents at once. Men cursed, sweating through their coats. Isaiah stopped. "She don't cry no more," he said, so quietly that the words almost fell at his own feet. "But she's scared." For a moment, everything stilled. The river gurgled somewhere unseen. A horse snorted. No one had told him she had been crying, or that she had stopped. One of the older women from the quarters, who had followed at a distance, folded her arms tight across her chest and whispered, "Heavy ground." Soul standing up. They pressed him on. "Where, boy?" Cobb snapped. "Point." Isaiah's bare feet sank a little into the muck. He turned once, twice, like a compass needle shaking before it settles. Then he lifted his hand and pointed past a clump of cattails toward a dense tangle of brush hugging a shallow, black-edged pool. The dogs hit the thicket first. They plunged in, then recoiled, barking in a different tone now, high and uneasy. One began to whine, paws digging at the mud. A man with a torch pushed in after them, cursing as brambles ripped his sleeves. "Hold that light. Here! Here!" Out from the green, from under a mat of crushed reeds, came a sound so small it almost didn't belong in that savage night. A hitching, raw little breath. Then another. They dragged back the broken branches, and there she was, Eleanor, streaked with mud, dress torn, legs full of scratches, lips pale but moving. Her chest fluttered like a bird's. She clutched at the air when the torchlight hit her face. "They walked right past here," one of the riders muttered, voice gone hoarse. "We was here. We was right here." No one answered him. For a long moment, even the dogs held still. Whitfield took his daughter into his arms, her small body sagging against his vest, wet and trembling. As he turned, his eyes fell on Isaiah, who stood a few yards back, shoulders hunched, hands balled now, as if he were bracing himself against something only he could feel. The planter looked at the boy longer than a man like him ought to look at any slave child. There was no smile in it, no blessing. Only a thin, searching fear, like he was measuring not what the boy had done, but what it meant. Behind him, Cobb leaned close and said under his breath, "He ain't natural, sir." In the official records of Barnwell County for 1857, there is no line explaining how Eleanor Whitfield was recovered from the swamps of the Edisto. The entries move from "child missing" to "child returned" with the cold efficiency of ink. But in the private notebook of a local physician, one brief sentence appears. "The Negro boy located her as if drawn by a weight in his chest." That sentence never made its way into any courthouse ledger or church report. Somewhere between the swamp and the archive, the story of that night was thinned, washed, and filed away without his name. The question is why, and what else, besides a frightened child, they were trying to keep from the light. By dawn, the torches were only black scars in the yard, but the story was already walking the rows on its own legs. In the cotton fields, women bent over the plants whispered while their fingers moved. At the smokehouse, men passed the tale between them with the tobacco. Some said the hounds would have come to that thicket sooner or later. "Dogs done the work," one overseer grumbled, as if saying it out loud could make it true. Others, more honest with themselves, lowered their voices. The child had moved straight toward a place every grown man there had overlooked. "He feel where the world dip," one old field hand muttered, "like a hunting dog, but different." On most southern plantations, strange things happened and were buried by morning. This one wasn't. It left a thin mark, a scratch, on the papers of white men who preferred smooth pages. And that, if you'll allow me, is where you and I come in. You're listening, maybe, from South Carolina itself. Maybe from Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles. Maybe from a small town whose name never makes national news. If you are willing, Tell me in the comments where you are hearing this from, and whether your family ever spoke, even in passing, about someone who just knew where an accident had happened, or where to look for a missing person without any clear reason. Those quiet stories live in kitchen corners and car rides, and they rarely reach the archive boxes. Because this is not in truth just a tale about a black boy from Barnwell District who could find lost people by walking into the heavy places. It is a story about what happens when any kind of black exception, of mind, of spirit, of body, pushes against a system built on the lie of inferiority. A slave with a gift that cannot be priced or explained is dangerous. If you admit the gift is real, you have to admit the person is more than property. If you admit he can go where you cannot, feel what you cannot, you have to ask why he is in chains and you are not. So the record bends. What we have today are fragments. The private notebook of Dr. Nathaniel Green, a white physician in Barnwell, where he tries to pin Isaiah down in the language of pulse rates and somatic impressions. A handful of letters from Reverend Thomas Avery to a colleague in Charleston, fretting about a colored boy with an uncanny sense for calamity. Decades later, the shaky voices of former slaves, captured in the 1930s by the WPA, remembering a child who walked where the ground hurt. In the county files, we find torn pages, names scraped off, entire lines ruled out in thick ink. Some of Dr. Green's papers, we now know, were later boxed and labeled under a chilling heading: Colored Insanity Cases, shipped off to the medical college in Charleston, and sealed as confidential in the 1920s. A convenient place to bury anything that suggested a black mind might reach beyond the limits the textbooks allowed. And then there is the silence. When you scan the 1870 census for Barnwell County, for a man of Isaiah's age and approximate name, you come up empty. No obvious trace. Did he die before freedom came? Was he sold away under another name? Or was he made to vanish on purpose, the way his presence was being trimmed out of sermons and court reports? 2 years after that night in the swamp, Dr. Green would return to Willow Bend with an idea: to test the boy not on a frightened child, but on a corpse, a body that was never meant to be found so quickly. That experiment would change Isaiah more than any whipping could, and its notes would be among those hidden in the insanity boxes. We will get there. But to understand how a child becomes a case file and then a missing person in his own history, we have to step further back into an older darkness, to the night the women on Willow Bend said the air grew heavy even before the first cry, when Ruth's labor began and a boy was born who looked at the world like he had already seen too much. The year was 1848, the same low country, the same sluggish Edisto, but a different storm. Not the quick fury of a summer squall, but a slow-building pressure that had been hanging over Willow Bend all day. By nightfall, the air in the slave quarters was so close, it felt like another skin. Lantern light stuck to the walls. Even the crickets seemed to rasp more quietly. Ruth's pains had started before sunset, while she was still bent over a washtub behind the cabins, hands in gray water that smelled of lye and sweat. She had tried to work through them, breathing shallow, until the ache wrapped clear around her back and stole her breath. By the time the sky flashed white above the pines, Aunt Millie had her on a straw pallet in the corner of the women's cabin. Willow Bend was cotton and rice both, white rows on the higher, drier ground, flooded squares down by the river where men stood all day in water to their shins, clearing channels, pushing mud. Field hands like Ruth rose before first light, swallowed cornmeal, and walked out in chains of hoes and baskets. House servants moved in and out of the big house, carrying trays, chamber pots, whispers. None of that paused for a berth. Somewhere up at the main house, Mr. Whitfield was likely reading his Bible by candle, counting bales in his head, convinced that the same God who blessed his crops blessed his title over every body in those cabins. In the crowded room, Aunt Millie moved with the slow assurance of someone who had done this more times than she could count. Her hand smelled of dried leaves and tallow. Beneath her breath ran a double current of words. Bits of King James she'd heard in the white church, braided with older syllables that did not belong to English at all. Years later, when government folks sat her down with a notebook and a typewriter clicking behind them, she would lean forward and say, "I knew that boy wasn't coming like other babies. Air got thick 'fore he ever cried." That night, the women around Ruth felt it too. Before each contraction, the room seemed to tighten. Thunder rolled far off over the swamps, but inside the cabin, the louder sound was Ruth's teeth grinding as she tried not to scream. No one wanted the patrollers roused, no drunk white man bursting in on a birthing bed. Hours dragged. Sweat shone on Ruth's face. Her hair clung to her temples. At one point, her breaths turned ragged and shallow, and for a frightening stretch, Aunt Millie feared she might lose both mother and child. The other women knelt along the walls, some mouthing psalms in halting English, some rocking and humming words from a tongue their grandmothers had known better. Then, at last, the child slid into Millie's hands. He did not announce himself. No sharp, newborn wail split the room. He lay in the crook of her arm, slick and warm, eyes already open, fixed on the low roof as if counting every smoke stain. Millie later said that in that moment her ears went muffled, like before a storm breaks. She felt a slow push downward, as if the floorboards under her had dipped a hair's breadth. "Why he's so quiet?" one of the younger women whispered. Millie rubbed the tiny back, cleared his nose, murmuring both prayer and something older. Finally, a sound came. Not a cry, but a rasping breath, a soft protest against being here at all. She wrapped him in a worn cloth and placed him on Ruth's chest. His fingers closed at once around the edge of the fabric, knuckles whitening with effort no infant should have. Ruth, still half between pain and sleep, searched his face. His eyes were dark, but not with the unfocused blur of the newly born. There was a steadiness in them that made her throat tighten. "He gon' walk places others can't reach," Aunt Millie said quietly, so only Ruth could hear. "And he gon' pay for it." Some women around the pallet took it as a sign. One touched the child's forehead lightly and whispered that some ancestor had come back through him. Another turned away, crossing herself, muttering that a baby who came so silent wasn't yet sure if his spirit meant to stay. Ruth lay there, body empty and aching, caught between fear and a fierce, secret pride. In her mind, the words tangled. "Lord, if you sent him different, don't let that difference kill him. Let it keep him here. Let it keep him free, if freedom ever reaches this place." By the next afternoon, she was on her feet again, hands raw in the wash water behind the cabins. Work did not wait for wounds to close. Isaiah, the name had come to her in the heavy dark before dawn, lay tied against her back with a strip of cloth, his small weight pressed between her shoulder blades. Now and then he lifted his head and stared, not at her, not at the sky, but down, toward the packed earth and the paths worn between cabins and fields. More than one person, catching that gaze, found themselves looking away first. In the ledger of Willow Bend for that month, there is no entry for his arrival. Just a line for cloth, herbs, midwife fee, Negro quarters. But in Aunt Millie's old voice, recorded long after her hands were done catching babies, there is one sentence the typist underlined twice. He could feel every soul the swamp tried to swallow, even when he fit right there in my arms. By the time Isaiah was 5, the days on Willow Bend had settled into a hard, predictable rhythm. Dawn horn, cold ash bread, lines of small and large backs, moving out to cotton and rice. Children too small for the field trailed after the women, picking stray bowls, carrying water, learning early how to stay out of the overseer's eye. That was how it was the afternoon Lydia disappeared. She was 4, all skinny legs and wild braids, chasing another child along the edge of the rows while the older ones gathered dropped cotton. One moment she was laughing near a rotting fence post. The next, there was just empty space and the rustle of plants closing behind her. Among the white men, no great alarm. An overseer said she'd turn up or not, so long as she hadn't slipped into the swamps and died where she wasn't meant to. Among the women, the sound was different. A low, tight crying pressed behind teeth, because loud grief could cost you more than a child. Isaiah was sorting scraps of cloth outside the cabin when the news reached him. He listened without moving, eyes lowered, then said in a small, flat voice, "She in a place where the breath sits heavy." He got to his feet and walked straight toward the fields. Ruth reached for him. Aunt Millie caught her wrist gently. "Let him go," she said. "Something already got hold of him stronger than we can." The cotton stood shoulder high. Isaiah slid between the rows, bare soles brushing fallen leaves, head turning slightly this way and that. He did not call Lydia's name. He walked until his toes found ground that wasn't quite firm, a spot where the earth had sunk a little around an old stump. There, half hidden in the shadow of the wood, Lydia had jammed her leg into a narrow hole. Every struggle had dragged her deeper. A copper-colored snake curled nearby, tongue tasting the damp air. Isaiah snatched a clod of dirt and flung it. The snake slid off, offended. He pulled at Lydia until the mud let her go, then carried her back, her arms locked tight around his neck. Some of the women called it mercy. "Child leading child," one said, voice trembling. Others watched Isaiah's feet like they might flare up on their own. Millie waited until evening, then brought a little dish of ash and pinches of salt, sprinkling it along his ankles, murmuring words that never reached the white church. "This to keep not every spirit from walking behind you," she told him. The next year brought Jonas. He was an old man, bones roped with muscle, assigned to the irrigation ditches. One dusk, he did not come back. No patrol rode out that night. An elderly slave lost to the water was cheaper to replace than a horse. Long before anyone spoke his name, Isaiah woke in the dark, chest tight, sweat cold on his neck. He padded to the doorway of the cabin and tugged at Ruth's arm. "Jonas down in the water," he whispered. "He not coming up." At sunrise, they found the body caught in a tangle of roots in the canal. For many on the quarters, that was the moment when strange luck became something else. Some said the boy was listening with his bones. Some crossed the yard to stand between him and their children, just in case whatever drew him might spill over. Ruth and Aunt Millie made a quiet agreement. No talking about what he felt when white ears were near. If he seemed to know where someone had gone, they would call it guesswork, or say God had simply guided the search. Not everyone was willing to protect him. One evening, Isaiah crouched by the wagon shed and heard 2 men talking low. Old Jonas's time was close anyhow, one said. But when that boy call your name, makes you think the end walks right behind him. If he keeps saying such things, the other answered, trouble gon' find him. Or us, through him. The words slid under Isaiah's skin like splinters. He had not told anyone where Jonas was. He had only said what his chest already knew. Still, shame rose in him, as if he had pushed the old man into the ditch himself. After that, when heaviness pressed against his ribs, he bit his tongue until he tasted blood rather than speak. Yet the pull did not ease. Some nights he sat on the threshold of the cabin, knees under his oar, chin unable to sleep. The ground seemed to hum faintly beneath him, like a drumbeat too far away to hear, with ears but close enough to rattle his insides. For a while, the knowledge of this stayed mostly within the quarters. Something passed between mothers and grandmothers, a warning and a blessing in the same breath. But gifts that unsettle people have a way of being noticed. A day was coming when the men on horseback, the ones who thought they owned every life on Willow Bend, would see that this small, quiet boy walked toward the very places they feared most. By 1856, Isaiah was 8, narrow, quiet, another small back in the rows. In the cabins, people spoke softly about how he found the missing. For whites, he was a line on a labor list. That changed the night Samuel ran. Samuel slipped away after dark, leaving bent grass behind the quarters and a faint track toward the trees. For Whitfield, it was not just one lost worker. A man who vanished without penalty suggested others might dream the same. Riders went out with dogs and lanterns. In the low woods, the hounds lost the trail in standing water. Hours later, they had nothing. Near midnight, an overseer remembered the boy. They hauled Isaiah from sleep into the yard before Ruth could stand. His shirt hung crooked, eyes burning from the light. "One of you gone," Cobb said, clamping his arm. "You're going to show us where." The feeling inside Isaiah was cold and thick. Samuel had chosen to go. Every part of him wanted to stay in the doorway. "I don't want to," he whispered. Ruth cried, "He's just a child." The whip cracked in the air, close enough for its wind to sting her cheek. Cobb didn't need to say more. Isaiah stepped forward. Saying no would not save Samuel. They set him in front of the riders. Torchlight swung over his bare feet as he walked. He moved as if through syrup, head tilted, ignoring the dogs. At a stand of oaks, he stopped so sharply a horse reared. "Here," he said. Behind one trunk, half hidden by moss, lay Samuel. Legs snarled in roots, clothes soaked, head at a loose angle over black water. Whether swamp or rope had finished him, no one asked aloud. "The boy led us straight to a dead man," one of the whites said later, like he already knew. That line reached town. Within days, Dr. Nathaniel Green arrived, officially to inspect the Negroes before harvest, in truth, to see the child who walked to the dead. In the big house, he put Isaiah on a chair, took his wrist, watched his eyes. "When you find them," Green asked, "what tells you where to go? Do you hear anything?" Isaiah stared at the floor. "My feet get heavy," he said at last. "My chest, too. Like something pulled me, that's all." Green wrote in his notebook, "Negro boy. No obvious insanity. Reports bodily sense of heaviness, guiding him to sites of injury or death." On Sunday, Reverend Thomas Avery came. After hearing the story, he had Isaiah led to a bare side room with a small wooden cross. "You found that man, and never saw him fall," Avery said. "Either the Lord's sign is on you, or something else walks near. You understand?" Isaiah nodded, though he did not. Later, with the boy gone, Avery told Whitfield and Green, "If this is from God, it must stay under our hand. If it is from below, we watch it. Either way, we can't have folks thinking a Negro child sees farther than they do." Before Green left, he spoke with Whitfield on the veranda. "I would like," he said, "to try the boy again. Not waiting on chance. In a setting we control." Those controlled trials would send Isaiah not toward someone still calling, but toward what had gone silent. A night of testing that would teach him his strange sense no longer belonged to him alone. In late 1856, months before the planter's daughter wandered toward the swamp, Dr. Nathaniel Green returned to Willow Bend. His papers said, "Seasonal Negro Inspection." On the veranda, he told Mr. Whitfield what else he had in mind. "I want to know if the boy's sense works when nothing should be found," he said. "Not luck. Proof." "What will you use?" Whitfield asked. "A body," Green said. "Known to us, not to him." There was one. A young man from a neighboring place had disappeared after punishment for plotting escape. In truth, he lay in a shallow hole beyond the slave-burying ground, covered with brush. 2 white men knew the spot. Green arranged to use it without leaving ink. Before dawn, they pulled Isaiah from the cabin. The yard smelled of earth. An overseer walked behind with a whip. Green kept step beside the boy with a notebook. "We'll walk," the doctor said. "If that wait you told me about comes, you stop." The air ahead already felt wrong to Isaiah. "I don't want to go," he whispered. Ruth stepped in front of him. The lash snapped over the dirt at her toes. "You go," the overseer said, "or she takes it." Green did not interfere. "If you refuse," he said softly, "others will pay. Walk." Isaiah obeyed. At first his steps were only slow. Then his shoulders drooped, breath thinned. Green wrote. Pulse raised, fear, no visible cause. Past the last familiar trees, the pull inside him hardened. A pressure settled under his ribs, as if the ground had caught hold of him. He left the path without thinking, pushing into scrub no one cleared. In the brush, his legs failed. He dropped to his knees and clawed at the soil until cloth showed. A sleeve, a shoulder. The still line of a jaw packed with mud. For a heartbeat, he saw his own face there, his lungs locked. He grabbed at his chest, trying to drag in air that would not reach the bottom. Green held his wrist, watching. Later, he would note, subject locates grave, exactly. On contact, shows distress mimicking suffocation. By evening, the story reached Aunt Millie. She rose and walked to the big house yard. "You twistin' what God said in that, boy," she told Whitfield, loud enough for yard and porch. "Turnin' it into another rope." Such words, from such a mouth, could not stand. They tied her to a post where all could see and laid the whip across her bent back until her heart failed. That night, Isaiah sat on the floor beside her covered body, arms tight around his knees. The hands that had brought him into the world lay still on her chest. He felt a blank where she had been. "I don't want it anymore," he told Ruth. "I don't want to know where they are. I don't want to feel it." She held him. Outside, the fields cooled. Inside, the boy, the dragging did not. He understood now that whatever pulled him toward the lost no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the people who chose when he must follow it, and who would draw blood if he ever tried to stay still. By the winter, after Eleanor was found, folks in Barnwell spoke about a colored child by the Edisto who could bring folks back one way or another. They did not write his name. On Willow Bend, the boy was enough. Whitfield began to use that sense like a tool. When a neighbor lost a man in the swamps, or a hunter did not return, a rider came to the gate. Isaiah was pulled from the yard or the rows, put on a wagon, and taken to ground where men, dogs, and lanterns had failed. One evening they led him to a rice canal where a field hand had gone missing. Isaiah walked the bank. Near a bend, his step shortened. He pointed to a raft of reeds. Poles went into the black water and brought up a body. An overseer muttered a prayer and would not meet the child's eyes. He was sent out again and again. Sometimes he led them to the dead, sometimes, more rarely, to the living. A white boy with a broken leg in the pines, a rider pinned under his horse. Men searched first and found nothing. Then Isaiah walked until something inside him pulled tight and he stopped. The more they used him, the more it hurt. A faint tug became a knot under his ribs. At times, it arrived with pain that was not his. He would be hoeing and suddenly clutch his chest or throat, sucking for air, though no hand touched him. In the quarters, people adjusted around him. Some drew near when no white ear was close. "They sold my girl up toward Orangeburg," a woman whispered once. "Can you feel if she still walks this earth?" He sat still, listening inward as he did by swamp water. Nothing answered from that far. He shook his head. The disappointment settled on him like another stone to carry. Others stepped aside when he passed, fingers brushing charms. "He don't mean harm," one man said, "but trouble walks behind him. You go where he go, white men find you." A fellow captive whose body helped catch. Runaways was its own kind of shackle. In Barnwell, Dr. Green opened a folder. Isaiah W., Negro boy, Willow Bend. He filled it with dates and places, noting how often the boy's talk of tightness matched the finding of a corpse or injured person. In a guarded letter to Charleston, he wrote that the pattern was too steady to call chance and too dangerous to print. Isaiah knew nothing of letters. His life had narrowed to one bargain. If he walked where that inner pull demanded when they ordered him, maybe Ruth and the others would be spared. If he refused, someone else would pay. On a post, in irons, or in a trader's cart. After a day when he had led them to a stranger's shallow grave, he sat on the cabin step until the yard faded. The night was quiet. Inside, faint pulls still tugged in more than one direction, like hands buried in the dirt. Up at the big house, Green folded his notes and spoke low to Whitfield. "This is past curiosity," he said. "If what I've seen is true, the boy isn't useful. He's a crack in how this county keeps its order." In that world, order meant the lines that held white over black. When something threatened those lines, the men who drew them did what they always did. They met behind closed doors to decide whether to bind it tighter or erase it. They met in town, not at the plantation. Barnwell Courthouse sat square and smug over its red steps, the same place where bills of sale and whippings were entered in neat ink. That evening the shutters were drawn and lamps turned low. Inside, Mr. Charles Whitfield stood by the window, hat in hand. Dr. Nathaniel Green sorted his papers at the long table. Reverend Thomas Avery adjusted his collar, eyes on the Bible he'd brought, as if it were another attending official. At the far end, Magistrate Elijah Barlow leaned back in his chair, boots crossed, weighing the room with the practiced calm of a man used to deciding fates. A decanter of whiskey moved between them. No one named the purpose of the gathering until Barlow did. "This Negro boy of yours," he said to Whitfield, "the one folks whisper on. I've heard enough to know it needs settling." Whitfield's mouth tightened. "He's mine," he answered, "like the rest. And he's been useful. Men lost in the swamps. That business with Samuel, the child." He did not say his daughter's name. "There's value there if it's handled quiet." Green tapped the folder before him. "What he does," the doctor said, "doesn't fit under useful so neatly. I've observed him locate the dead, the dying, without trail or clue. If I wrote this up plainly, if he were white, gentlemen, the medical societies would talk of me for years. But he is not white," Avery cut in, "and the Lord set the races where he did. I will not stand in my pulpit and tell my flock that some slave child sees deeper into God's workings than they do." Green watched him. "Still, Reverend, a fact is a fact. His senses don't answer to skin." Barlow's chair scraped. "Facts that trouble the peace have a way of being managed. You all know that. A Negro who can point to every hidden body in this district?" He shook his head once. "You think that won't draw abolitionist pamphlets, Yankee meddlers, talk of special gifts, among people we keep in line by saying they're less?" Whitfield glanced at the closed shutters. If word spread, he admitted, they'd want to take him. North, maybe. Poke and prod. Make him a showpiece. And if you let that happen, Barlow replied, you'd be advertising that everything we say about them is a lie. In a corner, Avery's fingers tightened on his Bible. I say this, he offered. Whatever moves in that boy needs to be under white authority. Church and household both. No talk in public. No stories in the quarters that make him into a sign or a saint. Green hesitated, then nodded slowly. So we agree. No mention of him in formal reports. I keep my notes private. You keep the law books and church records clean. The boy works when called, nowhere else. And if, Barlow added, voice cooling, this starts stirring up too much noise, if the slaves gather round him, if outsiders come asking questions, then we remove the source altogether. No writs, no inquests, just nothing in the record. Outside, in the dusk behind the courthouse, a couple of black men waited with the horses, hearing only the rise and fall of voices through the walls. One of them, from Willow Bend, watched the lamplight move across the windows and said quietly, "They up there talking over that child like he a sack of corn. In our time, we rarely see this trio, court, pulpit, and doctor, sitting down together in the same story. But if you've ever looked at an old file and felt something missing, a blank where a name should be, you've met the result of such meetings. If you've worked in archives or old church basements, you know the feeling of turning a page and seeing where someone cut out the most troubling line. If you have a story from your own town, where officials and preachers and professionals closed ranks around a thing they didn't want spoken, you can share it below. These patterns repeat more than we like to think. For Isaiah, the decision was made without his knowledge. He would go on being summoned when needed, and the same men who depended on what he felt would swear on paper that nothing unusual had happened. That pact held for a while, until a summer storm, when, in a single night, more than one life vanished into water and mud. On that night, the heaviness he carried did not pull in one direction. It dragged at him from all sides. The summer of 1858 brought storms that built all afternoon and refused to break. By evening, the sky over the Edisto was a solid bruise, lit from inside. The air pressed down on fields and cabins alike. That was the night 4 people went missing. 2 young men from a neighboring plantation were sent to clear a blocked rice channel before the rain hit. They did not come back. Later, a deputy sheriff and Thomas Barlow, the magistrate's son, took a skiff onto the river to look for them. Somewhere between the bank and the far reeds, the boat vanished from sight. By dawn, there were only loose facts: a broken oar on the shore, no men in their beds, no sign on the road. Panic did what reason could not. Barlow sent riders in all directions. Before noon, one galloped into Willow Bend's yard. The magistrate himself followed soon after, face drawn in a way no slave had seen before. He did not ask this time. "Fetch the boy," he told Whitfield. "Now." Ruth tried to hold on to Isaiah's arm. "Please," she whispered. Though she knew Mercy was not seated in that carriage, her fingers were pried away. The child was pushed toward the wagon, eyes glazed, the old familiar pressure already stirring in his chest. Down at the swollen river, a crowd had gathered. White men with ropes and poles, a few black rowers, Dr. Green with his notebook, Reverend Avery clutching a damp Bible. Rain hung just above them, waiting. Isaiah stepped to the water's edge. He shut his eyes. This time the pull did not come like one rope. It arrived in knots. "There's a hard place that way," he said, nodding up the canal. Another. He turned, pointed toward the drowned rice fields. His voice thinned. And one more. Farther. It pulling the most. They thought he was confused, but they had no better map. Barlow split the men into groups, sending them along the directions the boy named. Greene went with Isaiah. The first stop was a side channel thick with weeds. Before the poles touched bottom, Isaiah's shoulders hunched. He pointed at a mat of floating grass. When they prodded there, something bumped the surface. One of the missing slaves rose up in the muddy water, eyes filmed, limbs tangled in roots. Further along, they found the second the same way. News ran fast along the bank. The boy marked them, a rower muttered. Didn't need to see a shoe nor nothing. The second heaviness pulled inland, past where ordinary sense would have searched. Men sent on that line found the overturned skiff wedged among cypress knees, scraps of cloth caught in the bark. No bodies, just proof the river had had them. The last pull dragged at Isaiah like a hand around his ribs. He moved into the low, treacherous ground where swamp and shore braided together. Every step sank. Twice he fell to his knees, palms sliding in black muck. "Stop there," someone called. "Ain't nothing but mud." Isaiah shook his head. He could feel a faint, frantic beating that was not his, somewhere below. He dropped forward and clawed at the wet earth with both hands. His fingers met fabric, then hair. Thomas Barlow came up out of the mire gasping, half buried in sucking mud, face gray. Men rushed in with poles to haul him clear before the ground could take him back. His father stumbled, for a breath, looking as if he might embrace the child who had pointed to that exact spot. Instead, he gripped his recovering son and stared at Isaiah, as if at a loaded gun. Isaiah swayed. Whatever he had been following did not let go easily. Words poured from his mouth, half sense, half echo. Old names from Willow Bend, a scrap of a hymn Aunt Millie used to hum, a hoarse chuckle that sounded too much like Jonas. Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed on the riverbank. Greene knelt at his side, fingers at the thin neck, then at his own notebook, pen moving fast. Later, in a cramped hand, he would write, "Multiple successful localizations in single event. Witnesses numerous and varied. Phenomenon beyond coincidence, therefore unfit for open discussion." On the official lines, the day read differently. Brave men searching, a grateful father, neighbors recovered and accounted for. No mention of the boy who walked toward 3 different points of dread and found each one. From that night on, there was no honest way for those present to say they had seen nothing out of the ordinary. So they chose another path, to speak of it only in corners and to keep his name off every page that mattered. In the next turn of this story, we will see how quickly gratitude turned into a quieter violence, the kind that works not with rope and whips, but with omissions, revisions, and fire. The River Night did not make it into the Sunday sermon. Thomas Barlow was back in his pew by the next week, pale but upright. Reverend Avery lifted his hands and thanked God for the courage of our men and the mercy that spared a young life. He spoke of storms, of vigilance, of the Lord's protection. He did not mention a black child kneeling in the mud, digging where no human eye could see. In town, people heard that the magistrate's son had nearly drowned and been saved by quick neighbors. Around cabin fires, the story ran a different way, how the boy had staggered as if pulled on 3 chains at once, how he had fallen right over the place where Thomas's breath was slipping away. 2 parallel versions of the same night, moving along tracks that might never touch. Behind closed doors, the men who had met in the courthouse understood what they'd witnessed. They also understood what it would cost them to admit it. In the county books, the entries were simple. 2 Negro men found deceased in canal. Young white male recovered following boating mishap. Search parties successful. No more. At his desk, Greene tried to write a report for the Charleston Society, that would satisfy both his training and his caution. Every attempt broke on the same rock. If he told the whole truth, he would have to state plainly that a black child's unexplained ability had outstripped every civilized method of search they possessed. To say less was to lie. So he split himself. In his official letter, he wrote in safe, vague terms: local assistance, thorough efforts, fortunate outcome. Then, in his private journal, he recorded what he had actually seen: times, directions, the way Isaiah's body mirrored wounds he had not yet approached. For the sake of stability, he added in one tired line, these observations must remain between these covers. On Willow Bend, the reaction was more direct. Isaiah's world shrank. Whitfield ordered that he was not to leave plantation grounds without permission. An overseer's eye followed him more closely than before. Ruth was warned, plain and hard. If she encouraged foolish talk about her son's senses, she could be sold away from him with no further discussion. The boy was summoned only when needed, and kept out of sight otherwise. His rare hours of play vanished. Even walking alone beyond the cabins drew questions. Among the enslaved, the urge to remember fought against the need to survive. A man named Abel, whose mistress had once made him spell out labels on medicine jars, began scratching little notes on scraps of paper, begged or stolen. Dates, a few crooked words. Night River Take 4, he wrote once. Boy find white chili, another time. He tucked the slips into a split post behind the quarters, trusting wood and time more than the courthouse shelf. If you've ever worked with old records, church books, courthouse ledgers, yellowed hospital files, you may have felt that odd chill turning a page and finding a blank where something should be. A missing line, a burned corner, a name rubbed out. That emptiness is not always accident. Sometimes it is the mark of hands that chose not to let a fact exist on paper. Here, too, some things survived. Green's journal did not burn with him. A few of Abel's scraps endured longer than the post that hid them. Church notes were boxed instead of thrown away. They drifted forward, misfiled, mislabeled, until the labels meant less than the words underneath. Decades later, in the lean years of the 1930s, a young researcher sorting through a stack marked Miscellaneous Barnwell County would open one such box. Between a pastor's receipt and an insect-eaten deed, he would read a single line about a Negro boy on Willow Bend, strangely apt at finding the lost, and realize he was looking at the edge of a story others had tried very hard not to tell. By 1936, the storm over Barnwell lived only in paper and in old people's voices. In Columbia, South Carolina, the State Archive building held both. On the third floor, in a room that smelled of dust and paste, a young man named Edward Langley sat with a pencil behind his ear and a stack of works, Progress Administration forms at his elbow. His assignment for the Federal Writers Project was simple on paper: collect material for Slave Life in Barnwell County. He started the way any dutiful researcher would: court ledgers, tax rolls, church registers, names and numbers in tight brown ink. The official story of a county that believed it knew itself. The first hint came in a place it did not belong. Someone had boxed Dr. Nathaniel Green's old journals with miscellaneous county papers. On the lid, a bored clerk had scrawled, Medical, assorted, 1850s. Edward opened one at random and read sentences about fevers, broken bones, laudanum. Then a line stopped him. February, 1857. Isaiah, Negro boy of Willow Bend, exhibits extraordinary facility in locating missing persons, seemingly guided by somatic heaviness in chest. He read it twice. The language was clinical. The idea was not. A doctor who prided himself on rational observation had written, in his neat hand, something that sounded like superstition. Except, he treated it as data. Edward looked up Isaiah in the index. Nothing. He turned to the Barnwell court books for that year. There was the almost drowning of Thomas Barlow, the deaths in a canal, a missing child restored to family. No boy named. No mention of a slave leading any search. In the church records, he found a Sunday note. Special thanks for preservation of young Thomas B. All the white men on the riverbank were listed. No enslaved person was. The absence nagged at him. The same pattern in 3 sets of records, a result with no cause. Downstairs, in a different wing, the WPA office kept lists of elders willing to be interviewed. Edward copied 2 names on his pad: Sarah Walton, age about 88, and Moses Abel, near 90, both living now in shacks not far from where Willow Bend had stood. Sarah's hands trembled as she shelled peas while he asked questions. When he mentioned the plantation name, her gaze went past him. "My mama was Lydia," she said slowly. "She told me when I was little she got lost in the cotton and a boy found her. Said he always walked where the ground felt sore. Folks said he could smell where death was coming, but he didn't smell it with his nose." Edward noted every phrase. Moses came to their talk carrying a little wooden box, the hinges barely holding. "Granddaddy Abel, he try right a bit," the old man said. "Kept his scratchins hid. I found these when they tore down the quarters." Inside were curled pieces of paper blackened at the edges. On one, Edward could just make out, "Day boy find white chili." On another, "River night. Heaviness 3 ways." The dates, shaky as they were, lined up with Green's journal entries and the court's bland references to accidents. Back in Columbia, Edward spread everything on a table. The doctor's private notes, the polite omissions of the courthouse, the clipped thanks of the church, the scraps Abel had hidden, the voices of Sarah and Moses. The same unnamed figure walked through all of them. In his working notebook he wrote, "This is not mere legend. This is an instance of a black child's extraordinary ability systematically stripped from official memory because it unsettled the logic of slavery." Then he closed the cover and sat with the weight of that sentence. It was 1930s South Carolina. Jim Crow signs still hung over water fountains. A white man who wrote too frankly about black genius could find doors closed, jobs gone, files misplaced. So he made a compromise with the Times. For the WPA, he drafted a folklore sketch about a boy in the old days who felt where the dead lay. He softened dates, blurred the county, let the piece pass as local color. In a separate folder, unsubmitted, he kept fuller pages. Transcriptions of Green's lines, exact quotes from Sarah, careful copies of Abel's fragments. He labeled that bundle, in his own hesitant hand, "Isaiah, Willow Bend, to be pursued when the country is ready to read this honestly." Edward died in the 1950s. The careful packet slid, over time, into a university collection, its title half faded on the tab. For decades, no one touched it. Then, in another era of marches and arguments about whose stories counted, a different researcher opened the file and saw the same name. That is how Isaiah stepped, thin and barefoot, out of a gap in the record and into the edge of our view. Carried by a doctor's uneasy curiosity, an old man's hidden scraps, and a cautious writer who learned to read what had been written and what had been deliberately left blank. In the early 2000s, the archive in Columbia had new fluorescent lights, but the same old cardboard boxes. Dr. Lauren Carter, a historian in her 30s, spent most days at a table under the hum, working through the papers nobody requested on purpose. A gray folder marked "Unpublished, Barnwell County" slid onto her stack. Inside lay Edward Langley's careful handwriting, browned with time. She read his summary of Green's notes, the quotations from Sarah and Moses, the copied scraps from Abel's box. The same name appeared again and again, in faint pencil and ink. Isaiah, boy of Willow Bend. In the margin, Langley had written to himself, "Check post-war records, Freedmen's Bureau, Census." Lauren followed that prompt 70 years late, fingers on a keyboard instead of paper. Barnwell's 1870 listings had no obvious Isaiah from Willow Bend, but in neighboring Orangeburg County she found a line that made her stop. Isaiah Willis, 22, laborer, occasionally employed by search parties. No proof it was the same child, but the combination of name, age, and work brushed close enough to feel like a breath on the back of the neck. She pulled medical journals next, the way Green once had reached, for his own authorities. Late 20th century articles spoke of somatic panic responses and context-triggered episodes. One case from South Carolina described an African-American teenager who collapsed every time he walked past a stretch of roadside swamp. Decades earlier, the land had held an unmarked cemetery for the enslaved, uncovered only after construction work. The psychiatrist called it an anxiety disorder tied to local stories. Lauren wrote in her notebook, or a body remembering what the files forgot. A newspaper database brought up a different thread, a photograph of a middle-aged black man in a reflective vest, standing at the edge of a wooded marsh. The caption named him Marcus Willis, volunteer leader of a community search team. In the article, he was quoted saying, half smiling, "My grandma always told me, Willis men feel it in their gut when somewhere's wrong." I don't argue with her. When we're out looking, I go where that feeling sits heaviest. Lauren knew Langley had once traced a possible Isaiah Willis, leaving slavery with nothing but his labor and a name. She circled Marcus's surname on the printout, not as evidence, but as a thread. How many people like him live now, joining search parties, avoiding certain crossroads, getting sick to their stomachs near old battlefields or river bends, never told that their unease might sit on top of generations of fear and loss? How many get handed only the words panic attack or overreacting, with no mention of what the ground beneath them has seen? If you've ever stepped into a place and felt your chest tighten for no clear reason, you don't have to call it a gift. But you might ask whose footsteps, whose terrors, layered under your own, are being stirred. In her working notes, Lauren wrote one last line under the heading, Isaiah. Case of black extraordinary perception under slavery, intentionally omitted from formal record. Likely descendants, weight carried forward in body and story. Further work needed. We do not know where Isaiah's bones lie, or under what name he took his last breath. There is no portrait to fix his face, no headstone with dates. What we have are a doctor's unsettled sentences, a pastor's evasions, scraps hidden in a split post, elders' voices on brittle paper, and a pattern of lives that feel pulled toward hurt places without knowing why. Some parts of American soil still seem heavier than others. Swamps that swallowed runaways, fields that drank in blood, riverbanks where 4 people vanished in one stormy night. And every time someone walks toward a hard-to-breathe spot because something inside insists they must, you could say a barefoot boy from 1857 is keeping pace just out of sight. Not as a ghost, but as proof that black lives have always held depths this country tried to write out. If you've traveled with this story all the way here, it's part of you, now, whether you believe every piece or not. You can tell me, in the comments, what it leaves behind in you. Anger, sorrow, questions. And if you want to hear more histories that almost didn't survive the eraser, you know how to stay close. Follow, subscribe. Let the next story find its way to you before the silence closes over it again.